Welcome to the Developing Life Podcast. Welcome to episode 26 of the Developing Life Podcast. Design now reaches far beyond traditional aesthetics, impacting both society and the environment. So how can designers leverage their skills to drive meaningful and sustainable change? Today, we are privileged to have Terri Irwin, designer, educator, and pivotal force behind the concept of transition design. Terri's career spans several decades, from her foundational role in building meta design in San Francisco to leading transformative changes in the curriculum at Carnegie Mellon University. Her journey reflects the deep commitment to using design as a tool for societal and ecological impact, a perspective she developed further by studying holistic science and embracing systems thinking. Terri's work at the Transition Design Institute at Carnegie Mellon showcases her belief in the power of design to address complex global challenges. Her experience has shaped her views on the design's role in creating a sustainable future and how designers can broaden their impact beyond traditional commercial boundaries. With our host, Heather Crank, we're bridging the worlds of design and sustainability, exploring how thoughtful design can lead to better decisions and more resilient futures.
Thank you so much, Terri Irwin. Welcome to the Developing Life Podcast. It is so lovely to have you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here and great to see you again after so many years.
It's been a while. For those people who don't know, Terri Irwin was my instructor during the thesis program at CCA many years ago. And I have admired and loved her ever since and followed her career. So I'd just like to jump right in. I have a lot of questions for you. Let's go way back for just a second. So how did you first find design? How did you get into it? And what was your first role?
Well, I think my answer probably is not going to be all that original. Like many children, I liked to draw when I was young. And I happened to have a father who was a metal typesetter. And he knew about this thing called commercial art. So I think whereas a lot of people, when they're young, their parents fret that they won't make a living if they become an, my father said, oh, you could be a commercial artist. And I just sort of grew up with that expectation, and my parents had that expectation. So I had a pretty easy path into it. I got a summer job at the newspaper where my father worked, and just kept working there in the summers, and then finally joined full time and went to university at night. So, by the age of 19, I was working in what then was known as an art department, doing graphic design.
And then from there, so what school was that?
ASU. Back in the day, yeah, way back in the day.
And then from there, I know you studied Swiss design. How did that happen?
Yeah, great question. Well, I certainly went to university, but I wasn't a very good designer. And I was working in a department that was incredibly challenging, but I always knew I didn't know what I was doing. So I decided that eventually I was going to get myself back to school. And back in those days, in the late 70s, there were really two programs that were considered the best for graphic design, communication design. It was either Yale or it was the Basel School in Switzerland. And one of my teachers ended up going to the Basel School. And so I was able to go and visit him there. And when I got there, it just seemed like that was the thing for me. Mm-hmm. And it was also much more affordable, believe it or not, than it would have been to go to art centers. So I ended up moving to Switzerland in 1982 and spent the next 4 years studying with amazing people like Armin Hoffman and Wolfgang Weingart and others. It really was like a life-changing experience.
Wow. That's impressive. I remember you telling me a story once that your teacher told you everything you made was terrible. When you were in Switzerland. Yeah.
My hair used to come up and he would go, oh, Mein Freund, du machst immer Scheiße.
Oh.
You make always shit. And hey, he liked me anyway. We were very good friends. But the bar was very high. There were a lot of incredibly talented people around me, and I was not the best student there. And I appreciated the honesty. They were talking about your work, not you as a person. And I think anyone who's come up through design knows that if you are going to participate in critiques and get better at what you do, you have to realize very early on it's about the work and not you as a person. And with Weingart, you had to learn that real fast.
I think that's super important. That's a really, really important point, because I think a lot of people identify with their work, or their ego is really attached to what they produce.
Yeah.
And that's actually something. So when I went to CCA, when you were there, that I was like a crash course in separating my ego from my work.
Mm.
And I really can't advise people enough to make sure that the point you just made, that they listen to that, absorb it, understand it, and live their life with a level of detachment from what they do. So when you went from studying design into teaching design, how did you end up there? Like, what was motivating you to start teaching?
Yeah, great question. I certainly didn't go to Basel with the idea that I was going to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I went because I wanted to better know what the heck it was I was doing. And I felt like I was always terrified and always afraid it wouldn't be good. And even if it turned out to be sort of good, I didn't know exactly why. So I was looking for a better foundation. And when I got there, I think most of us early on in our career, or probably not so much today, because design has evolved into a very broad and multicolored, multi-flavored discipline. But back then, if you went into graphic design or communication design, it was still pretty narrow, and it was very much focused on form giving. And so I think I went with the idea that I wanted to be a better form giver. But what I discovered very soon after I got there, that it was all about process, and it was not about form giving. It was about thinking and concept. Now, Basel's been heavily criticized for having a very homogenous aesthetic, and I wouldn't argue with that. But it really was all about the process. And the form at the end of the assignment or the end of a project was really a byproduct of a very deep process that you went through with the instructor. And we stayed there for a long time because the instructors didn't talk a lot. They'd come around and they go, no, make it so. So they might not come around for another week. So it was very much a process that was learned and embodied. And I became fascinated by that. And at the end of 4 years, I wanted to share that. And I thought, heck, I don't want my learning to be over now. So to be honest, I really got into teaching because I thought it was going to be the most affordable way to keep learning. And I still hold by that. I certainly love working with students, and I think by now I'm a pretty good teacher. But one of the primary motivations is you continue learning if you're teaching, because you learn from your students every day. And that's an amazing profession to be in, where you always learn. Every single day when you go to work, you learn.
Wow. So while you were teaching at CCA, you were also running meta design. And you were, if I'm remembering this correctly, you were one of the few women who ran a design firm at that time that I knew of. It was very hard to find women in leadership roles. I'd love to hear about your experience running meta design, and then why you left and you moved to England.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was a partner in meta design, so I wasn't exactly running it. I mean, Bill Hill and I were the partners in the San Francisco office, and we had a Berlin office with the two original partners, which were Eric Spiekerman, Hannes Kruger, and a woman, Uli Meyer. And then we had a London office with 2 partners there. And we eventually opened a Zurich office with 1 partner there. And we met on a regular basis. So were the women in the minority? Heck yes, they were in the minority. But I think San Francisco was a really amazing place to be in the 90s because, we taught alongside Jennifer Morla was there. And Jennifer Sterling was there. And Lucille Tanazas was there. So there were women of note working in San Francisco. So I never felt completely alone. And those women were really doing it on their own. But it was frustrating. It was a very, very frustrating time to be a woman in business. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say it still is. But during those years, I wouldn't trade that experience for anything, that decade, and it coincided with Silicon Valley sort of emerging and booming and technology. But I would say by the time I got to the end of those 10 years, I was questioning deeply design's embeddedness in the consumer-led marketplace and our connection to what I began to perceive as some of the biggest problems around. And of course, if you were running a company, which back in those days, unless you were in the middle of the emerging tech field, your profit margins were maybe 8 to 12% on a good day. Mm-hmm. You had to keep the doors open, and you were taking jobs that were very much about selling things. Now, all of this disillusionment, I often say, coincided very neatly with the midlife crisis. At that point, I've been doing it for 30 odd years, and I get bored. It's a problem I have. About every 20 years, I want to reinvent myself because I don't feel like I'm learning anymore. I'm just doing something over and over again, and I get bored. So there was that. But I definitely wanted to find a way to align my values more completely with my profession and or I thought, I can't do that. If I can't learn to design in a different way, maybe I'll go join the Peace Corps and just do something with the second half of my life that feels a bit more meaningful than this does. Don't get me wrong. I'm really proud of a lot of the work that we did during those years. It just ultimately wasn't enough. And so I ended up leaving my company, I think a week after 9/11, and had no idea what it was going to do. None at all. And it was, after I sat on the couch and watched them digging out 9/11 on the television long enough, I finally said, enough. I turned the TV off. I went into my library and I just randomly pulled the book, The Web of Life by Fritjof Capra off the shelf. And I read it before. I'd followed Fritjof's work my whole life. And I just opened it to the chapter on systems thinking. And I thought, we always said we were systems designers at Meta. I'm going to see some parallels here. But I didn't. On that particular day, rereading that chapter, I only saw contradictions. And probably because I was adrift, I had no idea what was going to become of me. I lived alone without meta design. Who was I? I think in those moments of just, being in an abyss, perhaps, you have epiphanies you wouldn't ordinarily have. And my epiphany was we're actually designing in opposition to the way systems in the environment work, living systems work. Mm-hmm. So I just, God knows what came over me. I just had the temerity to write him a letter. I wrote him a letter. I knew he lived in Berkeley. And Rick Raffet had asked me to program the National AIGA convention in Vancouver the following year. And I just wrote Fritjof a letter and said, would you like to speak at the conference? And by the way, have you ever thought about how your ideas about systems could have relevance for designers? And sent it off. And I'll be damned, about a week later, I get a letter from him and he's like, oh, have breakfast with me.
Wow.
So I went and had breakfast with him. He showed up with a stack of books. He's incredibly generous. And he said, you should come study with me at this place called Schumacher College. It's the only place I teach.
Wow.
And at the end of breakfast, I just thought, well, I've got nothing else to do. I don't have a job. So that July, I ended up going to Devon, England, to this place called Schumacher College I'd never heard of. And for 3 weeks, I lived alongside and studied with Fritjof Capra. And while I was there, I discovered that they had this master's degree in something called ballistic science. And I don't know, again, probably because I was in this unusual space, it just seemed like the universe said, there's your answer. There's the next thing. And so I applied to the master's program. I got in, I sold almost everything I owned, and I moved to England to do this master's degree. And it turned out that the person who was the coordinator on the degree and who had built this amazing library was a man named Gideon Kossoff, who became my husband and my collaborator in transition design.
Wow.
You're over until it's over.
I love it. So I remember you talking about something called was it the bioengineers during that time? Is that right?
The bioengineers?
Maybe I have the term wrong. It was a group of people that you were studying. That's it. Can you talk about that? Bioneers. What is that?
It was a conference. I don't know if it's still happening, but for many years, the Bioneers was an annual conference that was often held in San Rafael in the Bay Area where I lived. And people like Paul Hawken and John Todd and, well, all of the leading environmental and sustainability thinkers of that period of time would speak there. And it was just incredibly inspiring. I think that was the first time I saw Janine Benyus, of biomimicry. And that certainly began to orient me more toward sustainability and sustainable design. But it was still, I think the designers that were talking about sustainability in those years were still rather rare. Now it was hard to find back then.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so you're in England. How do you come back to the United States? What happens?
Well, it was a long, very poor path. I did that year master's degree, and then I found out you could sign on to be a volunteer helper at the college. I didn't feel ready to leave. And you basically work for free, you get room and board. And so I did that. You cook, you clean toilets, you vacuum, you garden, you help the students that are coming on the short courses. And I did that for about a year, and then they hired me onto the teaching faculty so that I could teach design in that master's degree that I had taken myself, which was another kind of pivotal experience because trying to figure out what about the design discipline would be relevant to students who are coming from backgrounds in, agriculture or biodiversity or green activism or policy or government. That was very interesting. And I think it was what really converted me to the belief that big problems can only be solved through transdisciplinary collaboration in a radical co-design process with the people connected to a wicked problem. Because I got to have so many transdisciplinary conversations with people from all walks of life. And it really also was a great object lesson in how universal the activity of design is. Victor Papanak, I think it was, said, design is a ubiquitous human activity. All that we do almost all the time is design. Or Herb Simons said design was changing existing situations into preferred ones. And so for a few years, I just got to really immerse myself in that experience. About 2007, Gideon and I, who were married by then, had the opportunity to go to the University of Dundee in Scotland to work on our doctoral degrees in a group called the Center for Natural Design. So we moved up there in 2007, I think, to work full time on our doctoral research. And then out of the blue, I think it was at the end of 2008, I got an email from an old friend, Shelley Evanson, who was on the faculty at CMU at that time, saying, "We have mounted a head search. You should throw your hat in the ring." And I had known that program very, very well for many years because we hired so many people at Meta Design from it. So I knew there were some natural resonances. And I'm telling you, I had been out of work for a really long time, and it's of money. And so I just, on a fluke almost, I thought I had very little chance at being hired for that job. I put together an application, sent it in, and they flew me out for an interview.
Wow.
And I remember saying to them, look, if you aren't willing to put design on behalf of society and the environment at the heart of the curriculum, don't pick me. Don't pick me. Let's not waste each other's time. And as it turns out, they hired me. So,
wow, that's so amazing.
Yeah, it was kind of like it was flow. We spend so much time pushing rocks up hills, and it feels like when something is meant to be, you don't have to push the rock up the hill. I'm still pushing rocks, but that particular thing didn't feel like a rock.
Oh, I'm really absorbing that statement. Okay, so you're back in the United States and you become head of the School of Design at Carnegie Mellon. So how did that happen? And talk me through how you redesigned the curriculum, putting sustainability at the forefront.
Yeah. Well, as I said in my interview, I told them that I'm pretty sure I said, I'm not going to show up and impose some unilateral vision or expectation on the school. But the one criteria I'm bringing with me is that if you're not willing to just have that infused in the programs and the curricula, don't pick me. So when they hired me, I took that as them saying, yeah, we're willing to do that. And if there was one thing I think I learned at Meta Design, and I learned through making many, many, many mistakes, is that if a vision is going to be meaningful for a group of people, everyone has to feel like they had a part in developing it. So often I think leaders come up with their vision and they impose it on the system. And it's like, here's the marching orders. We're going over here. And I always say that in any group of people, about a third of the people show up kind of going, okay, what are we going to do? And another third will kind of go, all right, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And another third usually goes, hell no, I'm not doing that. And so I think the key is running a process, facilitating a space in which different configurations of people are given the opportunity to say what their vision is, what they absolutely don't want, what works for them. And so I just ran a series of retreats that broke people up into all different configurations, because there's always cliques, to try and tease forth a vision that was common, or a vision that everybody felt they could sign up to. And one of the metaphors I used, I think, was, and this is very ironic because I don't know how to cook, but I said, imagine that we're all ingredients in a pantry, and we have to bake something using every ingredient. No one can be made obsolete. Nobody's skill set, nobody's research can be made obsolete by the new vision. and the curricula that arises out of it. That's the no-go. So it's fine if we have a vision that enables some people to just keep doing what they were doing, but the vision ought to allow those people who want to develop and go in new directions to do that too. And I think in the process of doing that, people begin to see where there's agreement and where there's polarity, and there will always be. But the key is trying to find those zones of alignment in which something new can come forth. And transition design arose because I had hired Cameron Tonkinwise to join us from Parsons in New York. And as you probably know, Cameron Tonkinwise came out of a philosophy background, particular Heideggerian. I was a designer, and Gideon came out of a green activism and social theory background, but his PhD is in design. What we really had as the three of us were looking at reconstituting the PhD program started by Richard Buchanan many years before, which had been paused before I got there. It was a conversation between a philosopher, a social theorist, and a designer saying, how can we develop a doctoral program that is theme-based, that is about trying to catalyze systems level change? Because we all felt like the short-term single problem to a single solution to a single problem approach was not going to get us where we need to be. And Gideon and I had been living in Totnes, England, when a guy named Rob Hopkins founded the Transition Town movement, which is now a global network. We were at the very first meeting. And so Gideon had speculated about something called transition design in his doctoral dissertation. So Cameron was really the one that said, that's what it should be. And if anybody on the call knows Cameron Tonkinwise, you know that he is very compelling and very forceful. So that became the kernel around which we started ideating. But in its essence, I would say the new curriculum at all levels, the undergrad, master's, and doctoral program, really tried to take a deep systems point of view, and not systems as we normally thought about them in the 20th century, which was very mechanistic, but very much based upon living systems principles, ideas from chaos and complexity theories, Gaia theory, properties of emergence, things like that. So we really engaged, I would say, for 2 solid years, the faculty in a deep conversation about how those principles could inform new ways of designing.
So if somebody didn't know what living systems were, can you point to a particular reference? Someone might look that up. I'm not sure everybody knows I know what living systems are, but can you help our listeners out just a little bit?
Well, we're really talking about all of the principles that are at work in healthy ecosystems. So if you read about deep ecology, if you read about Gaia theory, on my academia.edu page, I've got a little handout on what these principles are. But principles such as symbiosis, in the living world, in ecosystems, the waste of one organism is a food for another. There is no waste. There is only symbiotic flows of energy and matter through all of these different organisms. They're all connected in a web of life that is symbiotic. There's, we've heard for years about nature being red in tooth and claw. Nature is actually incredibly cooperative and symbiotic. And so to understand the structure of these systems, which are fractal, they're holarchic, meaning organisms are at once semi-autonomous wholes, but they are also parts in larger wholes. And this interconnection, the interdependencies that are characteristic of living ecosystems, really, if studied just a little bit, give designers everything they need to understand to begin to design in radically different ways. If you took that one directive that waste has to equal food, how might that change the way we design things? It would change radically. So, yeah.
So, with transition design, what was the ultimate goal?
Well, I think the ultimate goal is not to design a templatized process for solving wicked problems. The goal is to try and get us to think very differently and recognize that we need to fundamentally reinvent our socio-economic political paradigms. They are all inherently unsustainable. And instead of having them crash, we're hoping we can begin to transition them. And we feel like looking at a particular wicked problem and knowing that it is connected to any number of other wicked problems means when you address one, you are actually going through a doorway into a larger system that needs to change the direction in which it's transitioning. So our societies are in transition all the time. It's just that the futures we're transitioning toward right now aren't necessarily the futures we want. We can already see how our human activities have thrown Gaia, the planet, completely out of kilter. We've got two hurricanes inside of 10 days that wipe the middle of Florida off the map. Now, that's unprecedented. So the thing we always say is these interconnected, interdependent, wicked problems took a very long time to become wicked, and they're going to take a very long time to resolve. And the characteristic of 21st century Western societies is our propensity to think in ever shorter horizons of time. We think in terms of fashion seasons or fiscal quarters. And we want one silver bullet solution to one problem, no matter how big it is. And we want it fast and efficient, and profit is always hanging in the background. The imperative of profit and growth overshadow everything matters. They overshadow the welfare of people and planet. Profit is all. So we want people to start thinking about that and understand that we're going to have to develop radically different mindsets. Another metaphor would be we're sprinters. We're used to running sprints. We want it fast. We want quick rewards. We want the medal at the end of the sprint. We have to run a marathon or a relay race. That's probably a better one. We have a baton that we're going to have to hand off long after. It's got to continue after we're gone. So how are we going to develop the fortitude, the tenacity, and hopefully hang on to the optimism that it will take to stay with these problems through their decades of resolution while we are also trying to sow the seeds for new paradigms? It's like rebuilding the ship of Thebes while it's under sail. It's not going to be easy, but as we were chatting before the call, we've all been born into transitional times. And a transition to me implies something's never over. It's ongoing, but it also, I think, carries with it the promise that it doesn't have to be cataclysmic or dystopia, that it could be a gentle transition if we design for it, if we plan for it. But it absolutely has to be a collective enterprise and one that is cooperative and just for all living beings on the planet, not just humans.
Oh, I can't agree with that more. So if you were to give businesses advice or suggestions about a couple things that you think they could begin integrating into their practices, what would they be?
Well, that is a $10,000 question, isn't it?
It is.
Well, I think first of all, we have to come to terms with the fact that capitalism is not sustainable. It's not sustainable and it is not just. It's not equitable. And this economic paradigm has now so taken over the planet that the economy exists in its own right. And we serve the economy. We even measure the success of holidays, like the holiday season. Oh, the profits are down, the sales are down. It's going to be a really bad holiday season. It's like we're just brainwashed. And I think we're going to have to birth a new economic paradigm, an economic system that serves the needs of people and the planet before profit. And of course, the growth of the profit imperative is predicated upon the belief that it's okay to hoard money and therefore power. I mean, look at the handful of mostly men on the planet now that control all the power and all the wealth. This is not the way ecosystems work. This is the way cancer cells in a body work. It grows ferociously until the host dies. Weevils in a flower bin are the same way. They blow through their food supply until the system crashes. And that is the way we are operating on the planet right now. So the irony, I think, is that we very often don't operate that way in our individual lives. Anyone who has children is automatically thinking in multiple horizons of time, and they are perhaps foregoing near-term benefits or fun to save or invest in the longer-term future on behalf of their children. Yet collectively, we don't do that. Oh my God, the company's quarterly profits are down. The shareholders are gonna, have a fit. The CEO is gonna lose his multi-million-dollar job. And every organization is like this. If I just look at my own, if I were to look at what our president's salary is versus probably the lowest paid staff member, the disparity is unconscionable. And it's even worse in the industry. Now, mindset, as long as we believe that kind of disparity is okay, we are going to continue to have the wicked problems that we have. And the economy, it needs to flip. It needs to be there to help people meet their needs. But as long as we believe that certain, like the 0.001% on the planet, it's okay for them to control vast amounts of wealth while, wars are raging, genocide, war, I mean, poverty, children are dying everywhere. And this is just accepted as, well, that's the planet. That's the way it is. So the biggest thing that has to change is mindset. And for the people in business, I think we are going to have to ask heretical questions like, how much is enough? How big is big enough? And those actually are often considered to be heretical. Like, what if, do I have all I need? Do I need any more than this? Those are new paradigm birthing questions, but it's going to take the antithesis of people like Bezos and Musk, Zuckerberg, be brave enough to begin to care about the whole instead of themselves or the elites, and be able to model that behavior. That's going to not make me any fans out there, but really think that's what's got to happen.
I can't agree more. Actually, my personal view is that people are in the privileged position to have that kind of power, influence, and money. It's actually their responsibility to be aware of the amount of resources they're taking up in the world and what that cost is. I think it's
Right.
incredibly important.
Yeah. I mean, maybe one more thing I would add. I I think until we are able, particularly in a country like this,
Mhm,
willing to come to the middle in a spirit of compromise,
mhm,
nothing's going to get solved. Nothing. We are just living in such polarized times where anybody that disagrees with us is the enemy.
mhm.
We are not practiced in the art of debate and conversation and shades of gray.
Mhm.
And I have never in my life seen things as polarized as they are right now. And I really am fearful of that. Watching this polarization has actually made me less radical in my political beliefs.
Mm.
Actually, that's not true. I'm still a lefty, but you know what? I will step to the middle uh, and be willing to compromise on behalf of the whole. I think we all need to ponder that a little more deeply.
I agree. All right. I'm going to shift gears again.
Mhm.
In 2021, you won the AIGA medal. Um, what was that experience like for you?
Well, it was online. It was during the pandemic. Not like this. I mean, it was very nice. It's always it's always an incredible honor to be, given a vote of confidence like that from your peers. It meant a lot. But I think it's one of those things where you ought to swim around in it until your fingers get all pruny for maybe like 10 minutes, and then set it aside. Set it aside. Because um, one of the things that really bothers me about design and related disciplines, and certainly Hollywood and so many other areas, it's this cult of the celebrity.
Mm.
And it too is a wicked problem. Um, I just think the celebration of the individual during times when it needs to be about community and an awareness of the whole. And if you're examining yourself, it's like, what can I do on behalf of this?
Mhm.
I think sometimes these awards can like blot out the sky. And I think maybe when you're young and you're coming up through a discipline, maybe that's a good star to steer by a little bit. But I also think if we focus on that stuff too much, it impedes our ability to collaborate well
Mhm.
because you're like watering the ego every day, every day, every day.
Mhm.
And I promise you, whatever you think there is, when you get there, there's a there. If you are constantly trying to learn or do better or uh, do more. So the awards are very nice. Thank you very much, Wayne. But I think you just, it's nice. That's all it is. It's nice. And you get on with the work, and you don't focus on yourself all that much and building your little reputation, because at the end of the day, we're not in an operating room saving lives.
Mhm.
I have always tried to keep that one in perspective. We can make a big difference, but my brother was a paramedic for decades, and I had to measure right there in my own life every day
Mhm.
about the difference in, I'm doing a brochure. He's putting a tourniquet on people every day.
Yeah, I get that. Um, so we're just about at the 45-minute mark. I'm going
Mhm.
to ask Terri one more question, but while I'm asking her this question, if you would like to put any of your own into the chat, And in just a minute, I'll invite you to turn your camera on if you'd like to speak with Terri directly. Okay, Terri, so I would love to know what projects you're currently working on.
Well, right now we are working on an EU initiative called Co-Design for Transitions. It's an initiative funded by the European Union to create a network of doctoral researchers working in the area of transitions.
Mm-hmm.
And there are 7 countries and 8 universities that will be funding students to create a cohort of 13 doctoral students who will meet for the first time at the University of the Arts London around Thanksgiving. And we're going to be delivering 2 days of transition design training to these researchers so that they can incorporate some of our tools and approaches into the research they'll conduct over the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we're working on that. And we're also working furiously on what we hope will be a big, robust Transition Design Institute website. We have intentionally held off doing that until we were well out of the pandemic and had a better understanding of the lay of the land. And so Gideon and I are hoping that we can launch that maybe early in 2025. And that is really consuming us right now.
How would we find that website?
Well, we're going to blast out a lot about it, but I think the URL will be Transition Design Institute CMU, but I don't know for sure yet. Believe me, we'll publicize it. It'll be up all over LinkedIn when we finally do.
Okay.
Like if people want to get on our mailing list, all you have to do is email us and ask to be put on the mailing list, and you'll get the notice.
Okay. So if you would like to turn your camera on and speak with Terri directly, you are welcome to do that now. And while I'm waiting for that, I have one more question for you. What are you reading right now, Terri?
Not a lot of fun stuff. I'm always reading about problems. I knew you were going to ask me that. I've got a little list. So what's sitting down on the bench where we sit and have coffee in the morning is something called Invisible Doctrine: The Secret History of Neoliberalism by George Monbiot and Peter Hutchinson. Everyone should read everything by George Monbiot. The Sexual Revolution by Laura Penny, because I'm still obviously concerned about gender inequity. And lots of inequities. There's a really good book called The Israel-Palestine Conflict by Kaplan. It is incredibly nuanced because he just tries to expose how nuanced this problem is because of the many, many years over which it developed. And then one called How Media and Conflicts Make Migrants by Forkert, Oliver, and others, because I think forced migration is just going to be another huge, wicked problem that is going to affect us all real soon. And then in fiction, I'm a big science fiction buff, but one thing I'm reading right now is called Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. And I'm also looking at a lot of photographs by Robert Frank. MoMA's having a big exhibition of his work. There hasn't been a Robert Frank exhibition in a long time. So I'm very excited to go see that at MoMA.
And before I invite Petrula to ask her question, I just have to say, I've been following your beautiful photography on Instagram. And if you haven't checked out Terri's work on Instagram, please do. It's just gorgeous.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Petrula, it's so nice to see you.
It's so nice to be here. And I'm so happy that you mentioned the photography. I was definitely going to do that. It's extraordinary, Terri.
Thank you.
You identified this work, and it's around design. But part of me is sad to say the reality of how little designers have power. What what areas do you feel like transition design principles can be applied? What leaders, what sectors do you think this can actually make the most difference in? Because I don't know that graphic designers or designers are really going to be able to do this in the way that it's going to take hold on a greater level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for asking that question, because it enables me to make a really important point of clarification. Transition design was created as an approach to addressing wicked problems, big, hairy systems problems, which always manifest in place and culture specific ways. And no single group of people, no single discipline can resolve those. So we are not talking about an approach that you would use way down deep within a disciplinary silo, like graphic design or architecture. What we're talking about is what design can bring to the party in addressing a wicked problem, or what architects or policymakers can bring. So it's really about looking at areas the size maybe of Pittsburgh, which is about 300,000 people, or like we're working at Thanksgiving on a borough in London, which might be about the same size. And you're looking at what the systemic problems are in that area. So almost every city, you can look at the list: lack of access to clean water or clean air or affordable education or affordable healthcare, crime, poverty, decline of the pollinators. It's those kinds of problems that transition design was really created to address. And the tools that we've developed are really meant to be employed by transdisciplinary teams working in a radical co-design process with the stakeholders connected to and affected by the wicked problem. And that's an important language distinction. If you look at the stakeholder groups connected to any wicked problem, you're going to see some groups that are benefiting from the problem and therefore have no reason to want to see it solved. There'll be other groups that are agnostic. It's not hurting me. Why should I care about this? The groups that are adversely affected, it's always abundantly clear who those are. But if you don't understand the relations of conflict and alignment among all these different stakeholder groups, you will not understand where and what the barriers to problem resolution are, because you're not going to see the invisible group benefiting from the problem, thwarting the solutions any way they can. So we thought that was a gap. We didn't feel like most disciplines need new problem-solving processes. What we need is a way to frame wicked problems in radically large contexts that include the past, how it evolved to become wicked, the present, how it's manifesting in the present and who it's hurting, and the long-term future, which is like, what do we want to transition toward as we resolve the problem? Now, the approach, one of the last stages in the approach is to develop what we call ecologies of systems intervention. So it's like solution clusters in an ongoing cycle of problem mapping, long-term visioning, and system solutioning that will take, years or decades to resolve the problem. But when it comes past that point, like, oh, we've got concepts for this little solution cluster. Once you go about crafting those solutions, then you just leverage whatever process is available to you. It might be service design. It might be some process from policy design, depending on what the solution is. So I think, to your point of how do graphic designers wield that, if we can get communities and organizations and institutions interested in understanding that they have systemic problems that, if addressed, would automatically solve any number of lower level interconnected issues on the ground. That's actually a better investment of time and money and energy. And that's usually what my lectures are about, showing the trickle-down effect. If we can get them interested in systemic approaches, then people working as graphic designers or architects or community activists will hopefully get pulled into the crafting of those solutions, but it will have been working at a high level like transition design advocates, and it's not the be-all end-all, it's one approach. Then they will be called upon to help build those. The other thing is, I think there are always designers who enter through the doorway of a deep, deep discipline. And for whatever reason, they find themselves just moving upstream. And that's not pejorative. It's not bad or worse. I love making stuff. And I still get to when I do my lectures. But some people just have a natural affinity for working across disciplines and facilitating. So I think that there are, I feel like I'm not being very articulate
No,
here.
this is great, Terri. This is great.
Feel like there's a place in this entire ecosystem required to address a wicked problem. We're always going to have to make stuff. And one of the distinctions I always make to our students are, we have this idea that solving problems is always about making something new. And actually, it's not. Sometimes you have to destroy something or dismantle something before you can replace it with something new. So a lot of the solutions that we advocate in transition design are to say, what needs to go away? What needs to be dismantled? What needs to be scaffolded? Where are the shoots and buds of good ideas coming up through the ground that, if they were watered and nurtured, would really be great? And then maybe, just maybe, we need some new things. And then in addition, some solutions are about changing material infrastructure or creating material artifacts. But the most important ones are going to be about changing our minds, changing our beliefs, our assumptions, and our behaviors. So changing the non-material. But even solutions aimed at changing the non-material will involve artifacts of some kind and scripted behaviors. So part of what we do in these workshops is get people to really think deeply about how we can create solutions. What societal sector ought they be situated in for the greatest leverage? At what level of scale? The household, the neighborhood, the city, the region, the planet. So we're trying to get people to think systemically about what it is, what it's aimed at changing. And then at the point where you're actually making something, all of the disciplines have perfectly good processes and norms and guidelines that they can, employ to make that stuff. Sorry, very long-winded.
Oh, it's fantastic. Thank you, Terri.
Yeah.
Wow, my brain is exploding. I'm going to have to sit with all this information. Does anyone else have any questions for Terri? We've got 2 minutes left. Because if not, I've got some. Okay. All right, Terri, I'm going to ask you one more question and then we will close for today. What advice would you give designers who are just entering the field? This is a really precarious time for people just coming up. What would you say?
Well, I would say try to connect your values, align your values with your career if you possibly can, so that you're doing something meaningful that is beyond just you or your company's making profit. And if you can't do that right away. Go into every organization or institution that you're part of, certainly doing your job, but also trying to look at it systemically and try to understand if the company isn't able to align doing good with their vision and remit, why? So you can always be a student of systems wherever you are. You can always be a student of trying to understand why solutions are failing. And you can begin to see change one conversation at a time. I mean, one of the most valuable experiences I ever had was working for Landor Associates, because boy, I got to see up close and personal how very, very large design firms worked and what didn't work. And it showed me what I did and didn't want to do. So no matter where you go, if you have your sights set on that eventual alignment of your passion, what you want to do in the world with something bigger than you are, you might not achieve it until you're in middle age, like I was. But if you're actively learning along the way, by the time you are positioned to do something, you'll do it really effectively. So it takes it takes patience. But you may never get out of the belly of the beast. I'm in a beast. I'm in the belly of the beast. And I am, we were able to launch transition design even as we're embedded in a very all universities are profit oriented now, and the disciplines are siloed. It's the infrastructure we're stuck right now, but can still make change in that. And I would say, don't stop learning. Don't get complacent. Don't be seduced by celebrity, and learn to play with people from other disciplines. And I'd also say it's as important to learn to be a good follower as it is to be a good leader. And that's probably a topic for another discussion, but it's important.
Oh, that is so powerful, Terri. I think this is a great place to stop.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today. It has been my incredible honor to speak with Terri. Anytime I get with her, for me, is a big deal. So thank you for joining me. Thank you, Terri. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on the Developing Life podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Hey everyone, Devron Bowman, founder of The Developing Life here. Just wanted to say thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes with thought leaders, designers, and change makers. If you'd like to dive deeper into today's topics, or you have thoughts that you'd love to share, feel free to join the conversation with us on social media by following the Developing Life's channels on LinkedIn or any of our team members. We would love to hear your takeaways and keep the dialogue going. If you know someone who'd find value in these conversations, please share the podcast with them. It's one of the best ways to help us grow this community of creative minds. Lastly, reviews make a huge difference. So, if you have a moment, leave us a quick rating or a few words on your favorite podcast platform. Not only will it mean the world to us, but it will also help more people discover the show. Thanks again for being part of The Developing Life. Together, we're building a community where creativity thrives and connection grows. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep developing.